You wake before sunrise, long before cities, farms, or written history. The morning air is cold enough to sting your skin, and a thin mist hangs above the valley. Somewhere nearby, water trickles over smooth stones while birds cautiously announce the coming light. The smell of damp earth mixes with the fading scent of last night's fire. Around you, pieces of roasted meat lie beside woven baskets filled with berries, roots, and nuts. There is more food than your family can possibly eat today. But by tomorrow, much of it may already be spoiled. Standing in the silence of this prehistoric morning, one question matters more than almost anything else. Not how to find food, but how to make it last. What if one of humanity's greatest inventions was not agriculture or pottery, but the quiet realization that food did not always have to be eaten immediately? Archaeological evidence suggests that long before written recipes or organized farming, ancient people may have been experimenting with surprisingly effective ways to slow nature's relentless process of decay. Their discoveries could have changed not only what humans ate, but how civilizations eventually became possible. For most of human history, survival was measured one meal at a time. Modern grocery stores have made it easy to forget how extraordinary that reality truly was. Today, food can travel across oceans, sit refrigerated for weeks, and remain safely stored in cupboards for months. Yet, for nearly all of our existence as a species, every sunrise brought uncertainty. A successful hunt could provide hundreds of kilograms of meat, while the next several days might produce nothing at all. Seasons shifted, rivers flooded, animals migrated, fruit ripened for only a brief moment before disappearing until the following year. At first glance, this sounds like an impossible problem. Why would hunter-gatherers ever need to preserve food if they were constantly moving from place to place? For generations, many people imagined prehistoric communities living almost entirely from one day's harvest to the next, consuming whatever they found before continuing their endless journey. It seems like a reasonable assumption. After all, without pottery, refrigerators, metal containers, or permanent houses, what options could they possibly have had? Yet archaeology tells a different story. Across caves, ancient campsites, frozen landscapes, and coastal settlements, researchers have uncovered clues suggesting that prehistoric people often planned much further into the future than we once imagined. Cut marks on animal bones reveal that carcasses were processed with remarkable efficiency. Large hunting sites indicate that entire herds were sometimes brought down during seasonal migrations. In several locations, the amount of meat obtained appears to have exceeded what a small group could realistically consume before spoilage became a serious threat. That raises an intriguing question. If these hunters could not possibly eat everything immediately, where did the rest go? The answer may lie not in a single invention, but in thousands of careful observations passed from one generation to another. Ancient people had no knowledge of bacteria or chemistry. They could not explain microorganisms or oxidation. But they possessed something equally valuable: patience, memory, and an extraordinary ability to recognize patterns in nature. Imagine watching the same landscape year after year. You notice that meat hanging near a smoky fire seems edible longer than meat left exposed in the open air. Fish caught during cold winters remain fresh longer than fish caught in the heat of summer. Berries left under the blazing sun slowly shrink instead of rotting immediately. Certain caves remain cool even during warm months. Strong coastal winds dry strips of flesh until they become surprisingly hard. No one needed to understand microbiology to notice these patterns. Survival itself became the experiment. Generation after generation, tiny observations accumulated into practical knowledge. A family that accidentally discovered a better way to dry meat might survive a harsh winter while neighboring groups struggled. Children grew up watching their elders repeat techniques that had worked for decades, perhaps centuries. Over time, these practices became traditions, even if no one fully understood why they worked. This may have been one of humanity's earliest forms of scientific thinking. Not science recorded in books, but science learned through experience. Every successful winter reinforced certain habits. Every spoiled meal became another lesson. Nature was the laboratory, and survival was the only examination that mattered. However, preserving food involved far more than simply preventing hunger. The ability to save today's meal for tomorrow quietly transformed how people organized their lives. A successful hunt no longer ended when everyone had eaten their fill. Instead, it began a new challenge: processing, dividing, protecting, and storing valuable resources before time could destroy them. Suddenly, cooperation became just as important as hunting skill itself. This subtle shift may have changed prehistoric societies in ways that are easy to overlook. If food could remain edible beyond a single day, families gained something incredibly precious: time. Time to craft better tools. Time to care for children and older relatives. Time to explore new territories without the immediate pressure of finding another meal before sunset. But preserving food also introduced an entirely different problem. Once food could be stored, it could also be stolen, guarded, traded, shared, or fought over. A pile of dried meat hanging beneath a rock shelter represented far more than calories. It represented security, planning, and perhaps even the earliest forms of accumulated wealth. And that is where this story becomes far more fascinating than simply asking how ancient humans kept food from spoiling. Because the methods they developed would eventually influence migration, trade, settlement, and perhaps even the birth of civilization itself. The first clues to that remarkable transformation begin not beside a fire, but inside one of the harshest environments on Earth, where cold itself became one of humanity's oldest and most reliable allies. In places where winter ruled for months, nature offered something that no human could have invented on their own. Long before iceboxes, refrigerators, or electric freezers, the climate itself became a silent partner in survival. Imagine a hunting party standing over the body of a freshly killed mammoth somewhere across the frozen mammoth steppe during the Ice Age. The animal is enormous, far larger than any family could consume in a few days. Steam rises from its warm flesh into air so cold that every breath becomes visible. Ravens circle overhead, wolves wait at a cautious distance, and daylight is already beginning to fade. Leaving such a prize behind would be almost unthinkable. Yet carrying thousands of kilograms of meat across the landscape was equally impossible. So what happened next? Archaeological discoveries suggest that Ice Age hunters often developed surprisingly organized ways of processing these massive animals. Rather than dragging entire carcasses away, they carefully butchered them where they fell, separating muscle, fat, marrow, organs, hides, and bones. Every part had value. Nothing was casually discarded. Some sites across Europe, Siberia, and North America contain dense concentrations of mammoth bones alongside sophisticated stone tools, indicating repeated episodes of large-scale butchering. Researchers continue to debate exactly how these camps operated, but many agree that such enormous quantities of meat would almost certainly have required careful planning beyond immediate consumption. The environment itself may have solved part of the preservation problem. Sub-zero temperatures naturally slow the growth of microorganisms responsible for spoilage. Meat left frozen can remain edible far longer than meat exposed to warm conditions. Ancient hunters did not understand microbiology, but they certainly understood winter. They knew which valleys stayed colder, where snow lingered longest, and how shaded ravines could preserve frozen ground long after spring had begun elsewhere. In effect, the landscape became an enormous natural freezer. But frozen food was not without its own challenges. Predators could smell stored meat from remarkable distances. Wolves, cave hyenas, bears, and scavenging birds all competed for the same valuable resources. Preserving food, therefore, meant protecting it as well. Some researchers suggest that elevated rock ledges, narrow caves, or naturally sheltered crevices may have served as temporary storage locations. In Arctic regions much later in human history, indigenous peoples developed ingenious food caches built from stone, snow, or elevated platforms to discourage scavengers. While direct evidence for identical Ice Age structures remains limited, these later traditions demonstrate practical solutions that humans repeatedly discovered in cold environments. Even freezing had limits. Winter eventually ended. As temperatures rose, meat that had remained safely frozen for weeks could spoil with astonishing speed. Ancient communities therefore needed another strategy, one that worked not only in cold climates but also under the relentless heat of summer. This is where fire began to reveal an unexpected second purpose. At first glance, fire seems like the opposite of preservation. Flames consume, they destroy, they reduce forests to ash and transform raw food into cooked meals. But careful observation may have shown ancient people that smoke behaved differently from fire itself. Imagine strips of meat hanging above glowing embers rather than directly over flames. The fire burns low through the night, sending thin ribbons of smoke curling upward. Hours pass, then days. Instead of rotting, the meat slowly darkens. Moisture escapes, the surface becomes firmer. The rich smell of smoke settles deep into the flesh. Something remarkable has happened. The food has changed. Not simply cooked, transformed. Modern science explains that smoking can reduce moisture while exposing food to compounds that slow the growth of many microorganisms. Combined with gentle drying, smoke becomes surprisingly effective at extending the life of meat and fish. Ancient people, of course, knew none of this. They simply noticed the results. Interestingly, some archaeological sites hint that controlled use of fire became increasingly sophisticated over hundreds of thousands of years. Hearths grew more organized. Occupation layers suggest repeated use of the same locations. While proving that a specific fire was used for food preservation rather than cooking remains extraordinarily difficult, many archaeologists believe that once humans mastered the consistent control of fire, its potential uses expanded far beyond warmth and protection. The relationship between smoke and preservation may not even have been discovered intentionally. Perhaps a piece of meat was forgotten near the edge of a campfire. Perhaps hunters returned after several days expecting to find it spoiled, only to discover that it remained edible. One fortunate accident could easily become a tradition repeated for generations. This possibility reflects an important truth about prehistoric innovation. Many breakthroughs were probably not sudden moments of genius. They were quiet observations, repeated countless times until they became reliable knowledge. Yet smoke alone was rarely enough. In humid forests, damp air could undo days of careful work. Rain encouraged mold. Insects laid eggs wherever they could. Even perfectly smoked meat remained vulnerable if stored improperly. Ancient people needed another ally. Fortunately, nature had already provided one. It came not from fire or ice, but from something so ordinary that most of us rarely think about its power: the invisible movement of air itself. Wind is easy to ignore because it leaves almost nothing behind. It cannot be held in your hands. It leaves no stone tools, no pottery fragments, and no written records. Yet for ancient humans, moving air may have been one of the most valuable preservation technologies ever discovered. Imagine standing on a rocky coastline thousands of years before the first cities appeared. The sea crashes endlessly against the cliffs, filling the air with the sharp scent of salt. Strong ocean winds sweep across the shore day and night, never seeming to rest. Fish are plentiful during certain seasons. Nets, traps, or spears can produce far more than a small group could possibly eat before the catch begins to spoil. Once again, abundance creates a problem. Fresh fish deteriorates quickly, especially in warm weather. Without some way to slow that process, a successful day of fishing could become an enormous waste. But careful observation may have revealed something surprising. Fish left hanging where cool winds blew continuously changed over time. They became lighter, firmer, and increasingly difficult to tear apart. Their smell changed, their texture changed. Most importantly, they remained edible much longer than freshly caught fish left on the ground. Modern science explains why this happens. Many microorganisms require moisture to grow and multiply. As water gradually leaves the food, their ability to thrive becomes increasingly limited. Drying does not eliminate every risk, but it dramatically slows spoilage when conditions are favorable. Ancient people did not need laboratory experiments to reach this conclusion. Nature performed the experiment for them every season. Across different continents, entirely different communities may have arrived at remarkably similar solutions without ever meeting one another. Wherever reliable wind, sunlight, or dry climates existed, people learned to work with them rather than against them. Archaeological evidence from later prehistoric societies shows widespread use of dried fish, dried meat, and even dried plant foods, suggesting that dehydration eventually became one of humanity's most dependable preservation methods. This raises an intriguing possibility. Perhaps preservation was never a single invention at all. Perhaps it emerged independently countless times, shaped by local environments. Arctic communities relied heavily on freezing. Coastal peoples embraced wind and sea air. Desert populations benefited from intense sunlight and extremely low humidity. Forest dwellers adapted to smoke-filled shelters where slow fires burned for hours beneath hanging food. Different landscapes taught different lessons, yet they all pointed toward the same idea. Removing moisture often meant gaining time. Time, however, brought opportunities that extended far beyond survival. A group capable of preserving food could remain in one place longer during favorable seasons. Instead of spending every waking hour searching for the next meal, people could invest energy elsewhere. Stone tools became more refined. Clothing improved, shelters grew sturdier, decorative objects began to appear alongside practical ones. While countless factors contributed to these developments, reliable food supplies almost certainly reduced some of the constant pressure imposed by daily hunger. Archaeologists continue to debate exactly how large this effect may have been. Human history is rarely shaped by a single innovation. Climate, migration, technology, and social cooperation all influenced one another in extraordinarily complex ways. Even so, many researchers agree that greater control over food resources gradually expanded the choices available to prehistoric communities. Choices, in many ways, define civilization. But preservation did not only involve animal foods. Plants presented an entirely different challenge. Unlike meat, many edible plants appear only during brief windows each year. Berries ripen rapidly before disappearing. Nuts fall in specific seasons. Tubers can remain underground, but harvested roots often begin losing freshness almost immediately. Wild grains mature all at once, scattering their seeds if left too long. Missing these seasonal opportunities could mean months of scarcity. Fortunately, plants often offered preservation advantages of their own. Nuts naturally contain protective shells that shield their nutritious contents from moisture and insects. Archaeological sites across Europe, Asia, and Africa contain large concentrations of charred nutshells, indicating that ancient people gathered them in impressive quantities. While not every discovery proves intentional long-term storage, the repeated appearance of such remains suggests that these foods were valued precisely because they lasted far longer than delicate fruits. Wild grains may have offered similar possibilities. Long before agriculture transformed human societies, hunter-gatherers in several regions collected naturally growing cereals. Grinding stones recovered from archaeological sites dating back tens of thousands of years indicate that wild seeds were processed far earlier than once believed. Dry seeds, unlike fresh fruit, can remain edible for extended periods when protected from moisture. Storage, therefore, may have begun long before farming. That idea challenges one of the oldest assumptions about prehistory. Many people imagine agriculture creating food storage, but some researchers suggest the relationship could also have worked in reverse. As humans became increasingly skilled at collecting, drying, protecting, and storing seasonal foods, they may have recognized the enormous advantages of managing reliable food supplies. Rather than agriculture inventing storage, centuries of successful storage practices may have helped prepare the way for agriculture itself. It is an idea still debated by scholars. Yet it reminds us that major revolutions rarely appear overnight. They often begin with countless small discoveries accumulating over generations until one day the world quietly changes. And among all the preservation methods ancient humans explored, one natural substance may have proven more valuable than almost anything else. It did not grow on trees. It did not require fire. It did not depend on winter. Instead, it came from the sea, leaving behind crystals that could transform the future of food itself. Long before salt became a symbol of wealth, trade, and empire, it was simply part of the landscape. It shimmered along dry lake beds, coated coastal rocks after seawater evaporated, and emerged from mineral-rich springs hidden deep within the earth. To most animals, it was a necessary nutrient. To ancient humans, it may eventually have become something far more extraordinary. At first, salt's importance had little to do with preserving food. The human body cannot function without it. Muscles contract because of it. Nerves depend on it. Every prehistoric community, whether living near the sea or deep inland, needed reliable sources of sodium. Early hunters likely obtained much of it by eating meat and organs, while people living along coastlines could gather shellfish, seaweed, or naturally salty water. But over countless generations, someone may have noticed another remarkable property. Food treated with salt often lasted longer. Today, we understand that salt draws moisture away from both food and many of the microorganisms that cause spoilage. In doing so, it creates an environment where bacterial growth becomes much more difficult. Ancient people knew nothing of microscopic life, yet they could observe the results with their own eyes. Meat packed with salt changed differently from untreated meat. Fish exposed to salt remained edible long after fresh catches had begun to rot. Exactly when humans first recognized this relationship remains uncertain. Direct archaeological evidence is surprisingly difficult to find. Salt itself dissolves easily, leaving almost no trace after thousands of years. Wooden containers decay. Leather bags disappear. Even the preserved food itself is usually consumed long before archaeologists ever arrive. Because of this, researchers must often rely on indirect evidence. In later prehistoric and early historic societies, salt production becomes increasingly visible. Evaporation basins, ceramic vessels used for concentrating brine, and mining sites all point toward its growing importance. Some of Europe's earliest large-scale salt mines date back several thousand years, while communities across Asia, Africa, and the Americas developed their own techniques for obtaining this valuable mineral. It is possible that simpler forms of salt use existed much earlier but left few archaeological fingerprints. If so, some of humanity's earliest preservation practices may remain permanently invisible. Sometimes the most influential discoveries leave the fewest traces. Salt also changed something beyond preservation. Unlike wind or winter, salt could travel. A community living beside the sea could exchange dried, salted fish with inland groups. Mountain communities possessing natural salt springs could trade this essential resource for stone, hides, shells, pigments, or other valuable materials. Food that survived long journeys opened possibilities that fresh food never could. Trade networks became easier to sustain. Communities separated by hundreds of kilometers could remain connected. Ideas traveled alongside preserved meals. Technology spread with merchants and seasonal travelers. Knowledge itself moved because food could now move farther than ever before. Historians are careful not to reduce the rise of civilization to any single invention. Farming, climate stability, population growth, social organization, and technological innovation all played crucial roles. Yet preservation quietly supported each of these developments. Reliable food supplies reduced risk. Reduced risk encouraged planning. Planning allowed communities to think beyond tomorrow. That simple chain of events may have echoed across thousands of years. Still, ancient preservation was never perfect. No technique guaranteed success. Unexpected rain could ruin carefully dried meat. Floods destroyed storage pits. Rodents invaded food caches. Insects found tiny openings. Smokehouses caught fire. Even salted food eventually spoiled if conditions became unfavorable. Ancient life remained uncertain. Failure was always only one mistake away. This uncertainty demanded another quality that rarely appears in archaeological reports, but may have mattered more than any individual technology: flexibility. Successful communities rarely depended on a single preservation method. Instead, they adapted to local conditions. During cold months, freezing worked naturally. In dry seasons, sunlight and wind became powerful allies. Smoke protected food in forest environments. Salt proved invaluable wherever it was available. Nuts and seeds offered their own natural storage systems. Underground pits remained cool when carefully constructed. Different foods required different solutions. In many ways, prehistoric preservation resembled an evolving toolkit rather than a single invention. Each generation inherited practical knowledge from those before them while adding small improvements of their own. No one person invented food preservation. Humanity did. Not through one brilliant moment, but through millions of careful observations accumulated across countless forgotten lives. Perhaps a grandmother insisted that meat be hung a little higher above the smoke. Perhaps a child discovered that berries dried better on flat stones warmed by the afternoon sun. Perhaps an experienced hunter chose a colder cave because he remembered what happened the previous winter. None of these people expected history to remember them. History didn't. Yet their quiet decisions may have shaped the survival of entire communities. As archaeologists uncover new evidence, this picture continues to grow more complex. Sophisticated residue analysis, microscopic studies of ancient tools, stable isotope research, and experimental archaeology are revealing details that previous generations of scientists could scarcely imagine. Every new discovery reminds us that prehistoric people were not merely surviving in a hostile world, they were constantly learning from it. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson hidden inside humanity's oldest preserved meals. Because the story was never simply about keeping food from spoiling, it was about extending possibility itself. Return now to that quiet valley before sunrise. The fire has burned low. Thin ribbons of smoke still drift into the cool morning air. Bundles of drying meat sway gently above the embers. Baskets of nuts and carefully gathered seeds wait beneath a rock overhang. Nearby, children wake to a breakfast prepared not only by yesterday's hunt, but by generations of knowledge stretching far into an unwritten past. The people around the fire have no idea that one day cities will rise, ships will cross oceans, or supermarkets will fill with food from every corner of the planet. They are simply trying to make today's abundance survive until tomorrow. Yet in solving that humble problem, they may have taken one of the first quiet steps toward everything that followed. Sometimes the greatest revolutions do not begin with monuments or kings. Sometimes they begin with a meal that refused to disappear.